Hey, LinkedIn, and welcome back to Business Unusual. This is a live show brought to you by the LinkedIn News team, where we're talking as a community about the changing nature of work. I'm Caroline Fairchild, editor-at-large here at LinkedIn, coming to you from my home office here in New York City. There are few industries that have been more heavily impacted by the coronavirus pandemic than the retail industry, with thousands of non-essential retailers having to close their doors at the beginning of the pandemic. Millions of workers were either laid off or furloughed. In March alone, retail sales were down 8.7%. That's the biggest month-over-month drop since 1992. But as states start to reopen and retailers are also preparing plans to reopen their doors, activity is starting to come back. In May, retail sales bounded up a massive 17.7% month over month, a sign that the economy is beginning to recover at different speeds. But while retail sales are ramping up, so is the spread of the disease. Arizona, California, and North Carolina are among 7 states reporting new highs for coronavirus infections. On today's show, we'll speak with a CEO who is reopening her stores right now and also guiding her company through the pandemic. The CEO of Bonobos, Micky Onvural, will join us on today's show to talk about her plan. Of the 68 Bonobos stores, 40 are now open, and in a process, this is a process Onvural says on LinkedIn is going to take months to complete. Micky will also speak to us about how both the pandemic and national protests against police brutality have shaped how she views herself as a leader. But before we bring on Micky, we want to hear from you. The whole point of this show is to have a conversation as a community about how the coronavirus is impacting the ways that we work and the ways that we live. And on today's show, we're more specifically interested in learning how you're feeling about shopping right now for non-essential items as retailers start to open up their doors. So we have this poll that we're going to run throughout the show and would love for you to cast your votes. How comfortable are you shopping for non-essential items? Are you A, very comfortable, B, somewhat comfortable, C, not comfortable at all, or D, it really depends on the safety in stores? If you drop your votes in the comments, my producers are going to be taking tallies for that, and we'll share the results at the end of the show. And with that, I want to bring on Micky to the stream to join us for a conversation.
Morning, Caroline.
Hi, Micky. Thank you so much for joining us on today's show.
Pleasure.
So we're just talking about the reopening and the decisions that retailers are having to make. You're making those decisions in real time right now. Take us under the hood a little bit about what the biggest challenges are as you do start to reopen stores and bring customers back in.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge for us is once we obviously have a green light at a state level and a landlord level to reopen our doors is how do we keep our employees and our customers safe? That's sort of the number one concern that we have. And what's interesting is our model, as you know, Caroline, is one that is, it's a small square footage store where we don't carry inventory and where a customer comes in, tries on our clothes, we get them fit, as we call it, and then we ship their product to home. And what I would say is that because that's a fairly intimate experience, the pro of that is that we can actually keep our employees and our customers safe because we can really control the flow of customers through appointments, and we can really control the experience for that sort of one-on-one service that we have in our stores. So in order to make sure that does feel safe, we're obviously following the guidelines of many others around PPE and hand sanitizer and how we clean clothes and quarantine clothes between try-ons, sort of a standard operating procedure, if you like, for how we make customers feel comfortable. So that's great. I think what's really interesting, and you alluded to this in your is we have started to open stores. It's a very much a sort of slow roll process. I think as we learn how different states respond to the virus and respond to reopening, there is a very real possibility that we may have to close again. And so to your point earlier, we're making decisions real time, not just to open, but is it still safe to stay open? And will we have to wheel it back, or can we continue to push forward with openings or not? And it's very much on a state by state, and not even state by state, city by city and community by community basis that we're having to make those decisions.
And you shared with me earlier this week that you have had to make the decision of opening a store and then quickly having to close it back again. For the leaders who are on the stream right now who are also making these decisions, how are you working with your team in real time to make these calls based on what's going on at a state level or what's happening on the ground in stores?
Yeah, I think this has been the hardest thing as a leader, not just in the subject of opening and closing stores, but generally, which is there's so much data and you can act on the data, but then you have to follow your instincts. So we can have the data around, the what's required and what's possible from a law perspective. We can see what the competition is doing. We can poll customers like you have on sentiment. But at the end of the day, there's going to have to be a dose of instinct and gut of, is this the right thing for our employees and customers and the brand, honestly? And so I think my advice would be, follow the data as far as you can, but there's going to have to be a moment where you either take a leap of faith or you actually go against the data and say, I'm going to make a different decision.
Mm-hmm. And the pandemic is one thing that you're grappling with right now. It's one really big thing, but also there's these national protests against police brutality that's impacting retailers on the ground as well. It's something that you wrote about on LinkedIn recently. How is that impacting how you're leading at Bonobos, and what has your response been to date?
Yeah, so this has been probably the most pivotal and interesting moment in my sort of leadership journey, I would say, is that the long overdue movement around Black Lives Matter really has changed how I think as a leader. And I think that in terms of sort of how has it changed me, it's given me a new sort of appreciation of the contextual world that we're operating in and that my employees and customers are living in, and really has sparked me to go on a learning journey, as many others have. And I'm very much at the beginning of that journey, but it's certainly given me just a new appreciation of the world in which we live in. I think that's further exacerbated by the fact that I'm obviously not American. And so I am learning the history of this country as well as the history of the Black community in this country. From a business perspective, from a brand perspective, sort of how are we responding? I mean, much like many others, we have made a series of commitments around representation internally and externally. We have made donations to causes that we believe will help impact change. And I would say that is the beginning of a journey that we have to go on to really shift the way that we operate as internally as leaders, but also how we interact with our customers, and frankly, how we can use our brand, whose mission is creating a world where we all fit, to have an impact and really move along the dialogue around inclusion and diversity. And I'm really proud of what we have started from a conversation, a dialogue perspective as a brand. We have obviously been talking about Black Lives Matter in our social media channels, but I think that what I'm most proud of is actually how we have started to think about the intersectionality right now during Pride Month of Black Lives Matter and the Pride movement, and actually started to elevate the voices of that community in particular within our marketing and within our social media presence, because I think it's really important that we all hear those voices. It's been super important for me as a leader to hear them internally, and now I want to showcase them to the world as a means of us playing our small part in fueling that movement and creating change.
And of course, Bonobos as a well-known brand can have a big impact on both of those movements that you just mentioned. But of course, Bonobos is owned by Walmart. How are you speaking with corporate, and how has Bonobos' response in some ways influenced what Walmart is doing on these efforts as well?
Yes, we are obviously a small part of the very large Walmart ecosystem, but I'm really proud of the way that our employees are showing the way. So that has been everything from our social media messaging and really trying to influence and show the way that a brand like us can engage in this conversation in a meaningful and powerful way. So really sharing our best practices and what we have learned as we have entered into that dialogue. As you enter into these dialogues, it's not easy. When we posted on Juneteenth, we had very mixed responses in our social media feed to what we said. And I think that our social media team, and in particular our social media manager, did an amazing job of engaging in that dialogue in a really productive way. So I think there's sharing best practices of how you engage in the dialogue externally. I'm also really proud of what our internal people team did to really spark conversation internally on Juneteenth. So we held a series of workshops that are all centered around different pieces of content, from 13th to the New York Times podcast 1619, and really started to have meaningful dialogues internally as well. And in being able to share what we did there with the Walmart team, I'm really proud to see that many of the teams within Walmart followed suit and started having additional conversations internally within their teams as well. So how I see it is that we are incredibly lucky that we are able to with a relatively small team, be able to spark these dialogues and show a larger corporation how you can challenge and tackle some of these very complicated subjects.
And for those of you who are just joining this stream, this is Business Unusual. We're having a conversation with Micky Onvural. She's the CEO of Bonobos, about reopening stores also through this pandemic and what the road ahead looks like for retail. I want to say hello to Neela from Houston, Robert from Atlanta, Preston from North Carolina, Ida from New York, and Rachel from Delaware. Thank you so much for joining us on today's show. We are running a poll on today's show as well. It's something new that we're trying here on Business Unusual. And we want to get a sense for how you're feeling about going back to stores for non-essential items. So we're going to pull up that poll right now, I think, so that you can take a look at it again. Oh, it's going to be a little ticker back down there, I think. There it is, up a full screen as well. We got it both ways. How comfortable are you shopping for non-essential items? A, very comfortable. B, somewhat comfortable. C, not comfortable at all. Or D, it depends on safety in stores. My producers are checking the stream for your comments, and then we'll share the results at the end of the show. So be sure and cast your vote. Micky, this trend towards shopping online, e-commerce, that was something that was accelerating before this pandemic. But of course, now I'm assuming it's accelerating even more. You were speaking a little bit earlier on about the data that you're seeing on your end. Any data that kind of speaks to you about how the pandemic will impact e-commerce and the future of that moving forward?
Yes, we have obviously been doing a lot of research with our existing customers to understand what has changed permanently and what will return to, in inverted commas, normal at some point, potentially when there's a vaccine, etc. And I think what's really interesting is obviously over the next 3 to 6 months, there is an increased reluctance of consumers to go to store. What's interesting to me is what will they miss about that store experience, and how can we, based on that information and those insights, really sort of pivot what we do both in our online business and also what we do in our physical store space. So the data that we have been starting to see is that people will still miss the ability to sort of feel, touch, and try on product. So there's still going to be a place for a real world experience. I think what is fascinating is, what is the guide shop, which is our name for our stores, what is our guide shop's role in that physical experience? Or how can we try and recreate that in home for people? And I think that's where innovation will come, certainly for Bonobos, is how can we recreate some of that tactical physical experience for our customers at home, in light of the fact that there will, I believe, be a prolonged reluctance to go back into stores.
And as you think about it yourself, what does that really mean for retail? I'm the human who's always wanted to go into stores. There's people that are continually going to want to do that as well, I'm assuming, coming out of this. And particularly as you're thinking about reopening and making customers feel safe, what does that look like long term, as people still, we'll find out what the results of this poll, may not be comfortable?
Yes, I think that what's really interesting is, and I think this is where Bonobos is particularly well positioned right now, which is that, you probably won't want to go into a large space or a crowded space. So I think we're seeing some data around there'll be more reluctance to go to malls, for example, because you won't want to be with hordes of other people. So for Bonobos, with our sort of service model and our smaller footprint and our appointment-based product that we offer, you don't have to have an appointment, but you can have an appointment. I think it will lean more towards that more sort of exclusive, service-driven, appointment-driven sort of business, where you can have a really curated experience and also feel incredibly safe in the long term. And I think that service was something that, and the desire for customers to have excellent service, was a trend that was already emerging in retail. And I think that, again, COVID has just spurred that trend further, in the same way as it spurred many other trends further.
And you're relatively new to the CEO role at Bonobos, and now you're having to do this all remotely from home with 500 employees. What has been kind of some of the biggest challenges that you've faced, and how has your view on what it means to be a chief executive changed amid this pandemic? What have you had to tweak in terms of your style?
Yeah, so you and I've talked about this before, but I'm pretty transparent, and I believe that I'm sort of show people what's going on with my life. And that was always around, how was I feeling about certain things that were happening in the business? As you can see behind me now, real life has truly encroached And that division between work and life has completely eroded over the last 3 or 4 months. And my children often make, guest appearances in many of the Zoom calls that I have too. So I think that, again, much like with the consumer trends, what I have seen is that leaders are increasingly having to erode that difference between sort of work self and home self, increasingly having to be vulnerable, increasingly having to be transparent about the challenges that they have been facing. And that's certainly been my personal experience, but in talking to other CEOs who have been leading through this period of time, very much echoed by them in terms of how they have had to, through a camera, create connection by being increasingly transparent and vulnerable with their teams.
You mentioned vulnerability and you mentioned transparency. I don't think I've spoken to a single executive through this crisis that hasn't hit on both of those themes. But as you said, we've been talking about this before the pandemic as well, and it's been a part of your leadership style. I actually want to play a short clip from an interview that I did with you in 2019 and get your take on it now, if we could pull that up into the show.
Authenticity is something we've been talking about in brands. We're talking about it in cultures. And as I said, I think the extension is vulnerability. And what I personally have seen is some of the greatest leaders that I know and I have had the pleasure of working with have shown their vulnerability. And there's such power in that because you're like, they're a real person and I can connect with them. And wow, I want to follow them and I want to, learn from them and find out more about them.
It's a trip to see an interview happening, not via Zoom, but yes, Micky, I thought of you as soon as this pandemic started and I started to talk to chief executives because this is something that we've been talking about, you've been talking about with me for longer than this. Talk me through how you think this pandemic is shifting the ways that leaders have to lead and focus more on vulnerability, transparency, and empathy.
Yes, and I think beyond what I just talked about this sort of erosion between sort of work self and home self, I think the other thing that has happened is we have all had to acknowledge that we don't know how to manage this. There is no playbook for what we are experiencing as a country right now. That was true with the onset of the pandemic and even more so with the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement. So none of us have a playbook. We are all figuring it out. We are all having to learn. And I think that that's the evolution of the authenticity and vulnerability that I talked about before, is that everyone is just having to acknowledge that there is no playbook. And as I said to you earlier this week, I think one of the interesting things is how gut and instinct is coming into play for leaders right now. And I said this earlier when I was talking about the opening of the stores. Many leaders, and certainly many leaders that I have been around, have said, I'm a data-driven leader, I'm a data-driven leader, I'm a customer-driven leader. And that is true and that is great. And we should be both of those things. But I think there's a layer on top now where you have to follow your gut and your instinct and realize that we don't know where this is going next. So I think that's an important new sort of evolution of that sort of authenticity and vulnerability. And I think the other thing that has evolved, certainly for me, is that the frequency of communication and honestly, the sort of radical transparency. I've always said that I'm transparent, but I have been transparent in new ways with our whole organization on a weekly basis. So we used to do company meetings every 2 weeks. Now it's every week. And every week I'm sharing a business update of the new things we have learned as the situation rapidly evolves. So I think that on top of everything, it's about frequency of communication and this idea of radical transparency that I am sort of leaning into. And what's been really interesting to me is to see the positive impact that has had on our team and our culture. Culture has always been incredibly important for Bonobos, and maintaining that through this period has been challenging at times. But I do think that frequency and radical transparency has really helped to build the team and keep the team glued together whilst we're remote.
Admitting that you don't have all the answers, as well as being vulnerable, these are not things that come easily to most chief executives who feel like they do have to have all the answers. For those leaders who are on the stream right now and are having a hard time opening up and being transparent with their employees right now, where do you find the strength to be transparent and to find new ways, even in this pandemic, to be even more transparent with your employee base?
So for me, I think that it starts with small steps. If it's something that you're struggling with, I think it's about how do you be increasingly vulnerable with one person in your leadership team or your whole leadership team. Because I think what happens is once you see the reaction to that radical transparency and that vulnerability, it gives you the confidence to keep moving with that through the organization. So I'm lucky to have an exceptional executive team and leadership team with whom over time I have built that trust, and I have the confidence to admit to them that I don't have the answers. Maybe they do, maybe they don't, maybe we'll figure it out together. But that has in turn given me the confidence to go out and be that kind of leader with, you know, a group of 500 people that we have in our organization. So I think it's about how do you step into it. The first step is always the hardest, as with anything. But I think most people will be surprised by the positive response that they will get, and that I think they would have got before this, but actually that it's even more important now and even more appreciated now than ever when our employee base is uncertain. They don't know what's going to happen either in their lives or in the business. And so I think that it fuels trust because they're uncertain and you're uncertain. It becomes a mirror of each other, and it builds relationships.
And I'm curious, you talk about your executive team. Has the way that you've communicated with them had to change, or the way that you delegate, or the way that you talk to them about what's going on the home front for you? How has that been different through this pandemic from other situations that you've had in the past?
Yeah, I'm extremely lucky, as I think I've probably said to you before, to have an extraordinary leadership team. And how do we communicate? Highly frequently, and it seems like through 27 channels simultaneously sometimes. So between Slack and text and an email and a phone call on a Zoom, there's often multiple things going on simultaneously, let alone within the day. So it's that high touch, it's the infrequent short conversations, not necessarily bottling everything up for a meeting, but how do you maintain that high frequency, high touch communication across channels? I think that I've also really appreciated over the last 4 months. I have, as you know, 3 small children who are 9, 8, and 5, and they've been home, and my husband works as well. And for the first 3.5 months of this, we had 0 childcare. And it was really, really challenging, as you can imagine. And I'm very lucky that I have a team who has really stepped in for each other. As we have had challenges of balancing and juggling everything, I think the team has really stepped in to say, I've got this for you. I can take that. And so what's been really interesting is to see sort of the fluidity of roles and how can we share the burden between us. And that has happened, I would say, amongst peer groups. It's happened with, leaders and their team. It's happened in every dimension, that we've really had to be very fluid in terms of how we think about responsibilities. And I believe that the upside of all of that is increased trust, better communication, better relationships, and ultimately a stronger team that really understands each other in a whole new way.
You mentioned zooming out a little bit and thinking about what are the trends that coming out of this pandemic will stay in the workplace. Anything specific that you want to make sure that continuing out of this pandemic is part of your leadership style at Bonobos, or even the retail industry more broadly, that you think will last?
Yes, I think that my hope and belief is that coming out of this sort of more broadly in leadership, that leaders will learn and realize the power of leading with equal head and equal heart. So you obviously have to keep in mind that the business imperatives and the data and what's happening with your business, but how do you hold in perfect tension with that, the heart, intuition, your people, and manage both of those things in equal measure? I believe that will come. I hope that will come coming out of this.
Well, Micky, I always enjoy our conversations. I enjoy them more when they're in the studio in person, but virtually I'll have to take that for now. Thank you so much for your transparency and for speaking with us today on Business Unusual.
Lovely to see you, Caroline. Take care.
That was Bonobos CEO Micky Onvural having an authentic conversation with us about how she's leading Bonobos through this pandemic and straight through reopening. This is Business Unusual, a live show where we're talking about the changing nature of work. On today's show, we asked you, the members in the stream, to tell us how you're feeling about returning to shopping. I'm going to reveal the results of that poll right now. It looks like most people are somewhat very comfortable. It says, all right, the results are coming in real time. They're changing on my iPad right now. So how comfortable are you shopping for non-essential items? 23% very comfortable, 32.6% somewhat comfortable, 23.3% not comfortable at all, 20.9% depends on store safety. It's almost neck and neck there, but I guess most people are somewhat comfortable. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and joining us on today's show. This is Business Unusual, and we're a daily show. So tomorrow, my colleague Susie Jackson will be back with us at noon Eastern from the LinkedIn news page with a conversation on time management. All of our schedules have gone out the door with this pandemic. What does it mean as we maybe continue to work from home for many more months? It's a conversation I'm sure I'm not going to want to miss because I could use some tips. I'm Caroline Fairchild. Thank you so much for joining us.